A long time ago, during the early days on the island of Crotoonia, off the coast of Massachusetts, an emerging railroad named the Westburg, Bardington, and Mountain Railroad had placed an order for a batch of 12 new boxcars. These boxcars were to be 28 feet in length and were to be the first batch of what would become a huge fleet of them. This fleet of new boxcars would be utilized by the railroad to deliver goods across Crotoonia from its east end at Laszlo City Port, through the southern hills and mountains, and to the west, and onwards to the United States, Canada, and beyond. The corporate management of this railroad eagerly awaited the arrival of the boxcars. The American Civil War had just ended, and there was an abundance of new rolling stock, ready to be utilized to move freight and make money. Soon, the new boxcars would arrive and would be pushed into service. The day had arrived, and the 12 new boxcars were pulled in by one of the railroad's 440 steam locomotives. The management of the railroad, alongside some workmen, came to inspect the 12 new boxcars. However, when they had fully inspected all 12 of the boxcars they had ordered, there was a shock awaiting the corporate management, as well as the workmen. Amongst the 12 boxcars ordered, there was an additional boxcar, far unlike the others. For while the main 12 ordered were painted in a forest green livery, with brown ends and a brown roof, this additional boxcar was not painted as such. Instead, it was painted all white, with a pitch black roof. The lettering was also different, written in a different font than the others. However, despite the different font, it still carried the railroad's name. Last, and most disturbing of all, was the boxcar's number, for it came with the first 12 boxcars, and so it continued the number lineup. Its number was 13, and one of the numbers on the side was different, painted crimson instead of black, and it was in the railroad's normal Roman font, instead of the alternate font on the rest of the car. The railroad workers called it a bad omen. The corporate management, on the other hand, called it good fortune. After all, they thought, we've just acquired an additional boxcar for free. And so, the corporate management pressed the main 12 boxcars and the additional boxcar into service, and for a time things stayed relatively normal. Months turned into years, and soon accidents began happening with boxcar number 13. These accidents were relatively small incidents at first. Usually, another freight car, part of the same train, or even coupled up to boxcar number 13, or even boxcar number 13 itself would derail. These incidents were usually ignored, for derailments happened all the time, and very little damage was ever done. Soon, it wasn't just freight cars derailing, or even boxcar number 13 itself derailing. Soon, locomotives trying to pull trains with boxcar number 13 in it, or even locomotives coupled up directly to boxcar number 13 began to derail, and damage was being done. Then one day, boxcar number 13 claimed its first victim. Jerome Buckman was doing his usual work, inspecting the equipment and freight cars in Bardington yards. He was standing on the tracks, trying to solve an issue with a link and pin coupler, which were used at the time. He didn't realize he was in the path of danger. He didn't know there was a miscommunication and a shoving move was being done, and one of the boxcars being switched, specifically at the far end from the locomotive, was boxcar number 13. It barely made a sound as it approached. It slid down the shallow grate of the yard, like eggs on a nonstick pan, and poor Mr. Buckman was directly in the path. He turned, and immediately noticed the line of freight cars, especially boxcar number 13, coming straight for him. He had no time to react. and the last sound he ever made was a terrified scream. The men working on the locomotive heard the scream, and they immediately stopped the movement. The engineer went to inspect what had happened. He was ill-prepared for the horror that awaited him, for when he saw what had happened, he ran back to the locomotive, screaming in terror, yelling out to the firemen and the other men of the shoving crew, "We've just murdered a poor fellow!" The clean-up took some time, but it was eventually done, and after it was done, Boxcar number 13 was moved for repair. And it was at this point that the old-style pin and link couplers were being replaced by the knuckle, or Janny coupler as it's known. So Boxcar number 13 had its old, blood-stained pin and link couplers replaced. However, despite this terrible tragedy, Jerome Buxman's death was, to put it simply, only the beginning. Time passed, and soon a new century dawned. The 1900s had arrived, and with it came newer and more powerful steam locomotives. One of these new locomotives was named Shadow Guard. He was a 2662 Mallet Mogul steam locomotive, and he was built for the Milwaukee Road. However, unlike a majority of his siblings, who are known as the Milwaukee Road's N1 class, he was sent to work on the Westburg, Bardington, and Mountain Road, which was now being called the Mountain Road. He served the Mountain Road faithfully for years, and when World War I broke out in Europe, the large island of Crotoonia, like the rest of North America, came to bring aid in the war, delivering supplies and munitions. Some of the older cars from the 1860s, the 28-footers, were renovated and pressed even harder into service, alongside their now larger 36-foot and even 40-foot long cousins. This even included Boxcar number 13, and little did Shadow Guard know he would be its next victim. The year was 1917, and the United States had just entered the war. Crotoonia, being allied with the U.S., helped move supplies. Shadow Guard was tasked with hauling a train of much-needed medical supplies, food, and munitions to the east side of Crotoonia. The train was long, 70 cars or more, and in the consist was Boxcar number 13, right in the middle of the train, and Shadow Guard was concerned, for he knew the 13th boxcar was bad news. "I don't know about this," Shadow Guard called out. "We do know the reputation of that there boxcar in the middle." His engineer reassured him. "Now don't you go all nervous on us. After all, we got a war to win, so let's get a move on now. Time's a-wastin'." And so, Shadow Guard proceeded with his train. They headed eastward, down the main line and towards the eastern harbors of Crotoonia, specifically to Laszlo City Port, served by both the Mountain Road and the EM&O Railroad exclusively. There were many bridges and tunnels along the line. One of those tunnels, named the Weston Tunnel, was one of the longest, and it was just before that tunnel when it happened. The 13th boxcar suffered a hot box, and the engineer was flagged by the conductor in the caboose to stop. However, Shadow Guard didn't stop soon enough, and so he and his train slid into Weston Tunnel. He slid until he at last stopped, directly in the far middle of the tunnel, a very unideal stopping point. Weston Tunnel wasn't very well liked by the railwaymen or the locomotives. Its many curves were not ideal for visibility, and no one could even see the ends of it once deep inside. It was mostly downhill from west to east, and it was built to avoid the alternate routes through the mountains, which were much steeper and far less ideal for rail traffic. Edwin Clayton, one of the two brakemen in the caboose, was ordered by the conductor to inspect the hotbox. He didn't want to do it, however, the conductor had ordered him. So, he grabbed one of the lanterns hung up in the caboose, as well as a fire extinguisher, and proceeded in. The caboose was just inside the tunnel, at the entrance where they entered. Edwin proceeded in, unaware of what was to happen. He soon reached the middle of the train, where boxcar number 13 was. He inspected the hotbox, and proceeded to put out the journal box fire. As he did so, the light from the journal box fire diminished and disappeared. The only source of light for Edwin was the lantern, and as soon as he had dealt with the hot box, he journeyed back to the caboose. Meanwhile, on the other side of Weston Tunnel, news of the sudden hotbox on the eastbound freight wasn't received, so the manually operated semaphore signal was left raised, indicating all clear. The Mountain Road's premier passenger train, the Southside Flyer, and its locomotive, a 442 Atlantic, was speeding down the line, making up for lost time. The passenger train soon entered the tunnel, and was rapidly approaching, and soon Shadow Guard and his crew noticed a light began to glow around the right curve of the tunnel ahead. And they all knew that the glowing light meant one thing. They were all in terrible danger. Shadow Guard's engineer, Jet Morrison, wasted zero time. He lunged straight for the whistle, and as soon as he grabbed hold, there, from around the bend, came the Southside Flyer, rapidly approaching. He pulled down on the rope as quickly as he could, giving a long, unbroken blast. The Southside Flyer's crew immediately applied the brakes. However, neither of the crews could prevent what was about to unfold. The two engines, Shadow Guard and the Southside Flyer engine, gave terrified shrieks as they collided deep within Weston Tunnel. The jolts from the collision quickly bounced back through the rest of the goods train. The conductor and two brakemen were tossed from their seats as the jolt hit the caboose, and the sound from the collision echoed from deep inside the tunnel. The conductor and two brakemen immediately got back up, and the conductor exited the caboose, which was now outside the tunnel. The conductor, Larold Moore, looked back into the dark tunnel and exclaimed, "I think something bad just happened." He quickly entered into the tunnel. However, he was stopped by rising smoke. He returned quickly. Re-entering the caboose, Conductor Moore addressed to Edwin Clayton and Philip Dooney the situation. He told them to go in with lanterns and to stay low to avoid breathing in the smoke. He would go out to the nearest telegraph box to call for help. Edwin and Philip slowly but surely made their way deeper into the tunnel. However, they soon discovered something truly terrifying. There was a huge, roaring fire in the tunnel, and the fire was quickly making its way up the train. There was the sound of faint explosions in the distance. However, the roar of the inferno drowned them out. Needless to say, Edwin and Philip immediately ran back the way they came, for they knew that soon the entire train would light up. The two brakemen soon returned, covered in soot but alive. They informed Larold and the newly arrived rescue crew of the extremely dangerous situation the train was in. They decided to let the train burn completely. The smoke was now too thick, and nothing could be done. It took 1 week for the fire and explosions to die down, and an extra week for the smoke to finally clear away. Those weeks of sheer suspense were utter hell, both for the surviving train crew, the firefighters, and the rescue crew. The rescue crew feared the integrity of the tunnel as they ventured in. ensuring to brace the roof as they went along. The further in they went, they discovered the utter nightmare that awaited them. Every single wooden freight car that was part of the train was completely reduced to ash, with only their trucks remaining. However, even the bare railcar trucks and the metal freight cars were badly warped because of the flames and explosions that had occurred. Shadow Guard, or what was left of him, as well as what used to be the Southside Flyer locomotive, were both mangled, melted, and twisted piles of scrap, barely recognizable as locomotives. The paint completely burnt off, exposing bare steel. However, even these things paled in comparison to the most terrifying discovery, the greatest mystery to have ever come from the Weston Tunnel disaster, a mystery that even baffles those who look into the disaster to this day. Boxcar number 13, despite being made of wood, survived the inferno, completely intact, with barely any burns. "That freight car is bad luck, I tell you," said one worker. "No doubt about it. It's completely cursed," proclaimed another. The management, on the other hand, didn't take notice to the workers' superstitions, as they put it. Instead, they focused on figuring out what had happened. No one truly knows what happened. However, what is known is this. Engineer Jet Morrison, fireman Vincent Lode, as well as 10 people immediately perished in the direct collision. 77 more people perished after the collision, either being crushed by debris, suffocating from the smoke, or being burnt alive from the fires caused by the destroyed steam locomotives. The 87 survivors, most injured, escaped going out from the east end of the tunnel, heading away from the rising smoke. No bodies were ever recovered. All were completely incinerated. The management discussed with one another how the disaster occurred, as well as how the fire started. They deduced that the collision was caused by communication error, and as for the fire, they figured that sparks from the destroyed locomotives were what caused the fire in the tunnel. The CEO of the Mountain Road at the time, Drake Osborne, figured that, to ensure an incident such as the Weston Tunnel disaster never happened again, electrification would be the only path forward for the Mountain Road. Drake Osborne proposed the idea to the board, and the Mountain Road's board of directors all agreed, and so the final decision was made. The Mountain Road would motorize and electrify. Taking inspiration from the Milwaukee Road and their neighbor, the East Mountain and Oceanic, the Mountain Road placed an order for a fleet of new, General Electric-built, 2-unit box cabs. The long system of catenary wires were put in place, and as the year 1917 gave way to 1918, the order was just being finished up, and soon the new electric locomotives would arrive and would be immediately put to work. The first electric to arrive on the Mountain Road was named Duggard, and he was one of the new box cab electrics. And shortly after him, just a month later, was the second box cab, Al. Then in early 1919, the rest of the first batch of box cabs, as well as other electrics, arrived, including Bertrude, a passenger box cab, Bryan, a bipolar electric locomotive, and Bradley, a quill electric locomotive. The ultimate fates of the steam locomotives remained unclear. One thing was apparent: the Mountain Road would no longer need them. And so, the Westburg, Barrington, and Mountain Railroad began selling off their steam locomotives. Most would go off to the United States, while some were bought by the Crotoonia Island Railway, which it was called at the time, and yet others were scrapped. Near the end of 1919, almost every single steam locomotive was gone, all except for one single 440 switcher. One day, Dugard pulled into Bardington Yards, ready to pick up a goods train. There in the yard was the old 440, who Dugard affectionately called Weezer. Dugard pulled up alongside Weezer, and Weezer directed him to his train. Dugard was just coupling up to his train when Weezer said this: "You best be careful with that train. After all, boxcar number 13's in the consist." Dugard, upon hearing this, was perplexed. He never heard of boxcar number 13 before this, and he wasn't one to remain confused. "I must ask," Dugard inquired, "why should I be worried of some old boxcar?" Weezer, with a very stern and solemn face, rolled up alongside Dugard, and replied, "If you knew what this boxcar was involved in, you'd be begging not to take this train. However, you clearly don't know, and so I mustn't stop you. Please, proceed on now. You have work to do." Dugard, now with more questions than answers, proceeded on with his train, while Weezer watched on, worrying for what might happen. And old Weezer's worries were well warranted. That night a sudden fog fell down upon the line, and Dugard couldn't see anything. And then he suffered a head-on collision with the rear end of Al's train, for the switch was lined improperly. Thankfully no one died in this collision, but Dugard was severely damaged, and had to be brought in for a whole month of repairs. After that, Dugard, as well as Al, understood the cursed nature of the 13th boxcar. As for old Weezer, his days of usefulness finally ran out that winter when Reynold and a team of other electric steeple cab switchers arrived to take on his duties. He was sold off the end of the year, and later scrapped in the spring of 1920. The years started to go by, and the 1920s were rather eventful and prosperous for the mountain road. Extra box cabs were ordered, including Arlo and Bobby, who were built and arrived in 1920, as well as Baylor and Benji, who were built in 1926 and arrived the following year in 1927. Then came the 1930s and the Great Depression, which lessened traffic on the mountain road and its neighbors. In those years, the box cabs were upgraded and modified so there could be less locomotives to haul heavier trains. Al, in 1935, was given a center cab unit and became an EF2, along with a number of others. Arlo, in the following year of 1936, was given a center bobtail unit and became an EF3, along with several other box cabs. And Bobby, in 1938, when an odd number of EF2 box cabs were cobbled together and his B-end cab was taken, he became an ES3 heavy switcher. All the while, boxcar number 13 was wreaking havoc across the mountain road system, as well as the systems of the other railroads around the mountain road. Still, the accidents happened, and still barely anyone heeded the warnings. But the freight locomotives, one by one, learned to dread the 13th boxcar. Later, in the 1940s, specifically 1949, newer electrics arrived on the mountain road. These were the Little Joe's locomotives that were meant for the USSR. However, the Cold War had strained relations between the USA and the USSR, so these electrics were instead sold to other railroads. 3 of these new Little Joes for the mountain road were known as the Joseph brothers, named Atlas, Jeffrey, and Jared. Atlas would rotate between freight and passenger duties, while Jeffrey would be solely for freight and Jared solely for passengers. Later in 1955, Bertrude, the last box cabin passenger service, was ordered to work on a freight with the then upgraded Baylor and Benji, who in 1952 were upgraded to EF5s. As for Bertrude herself, just the year before in 1954, she had gained a new stylish front end, and she was not experienced with freight at all. The train that Bertrude, Baylor, and Benji were to collect was a long manifest, comprised mostly of boxcars, with some gondolas, flatbeds, with pipe loads, as well as a few tankers and reefer cars. However, there was still some unloaded cargo that couldn't fit, so Bertrude looked around for a spare boxcar. Soon, Bertrude found a boxcar. It looked old and worn out. Its once white paint was peeling off, and its black roof was faded into a dull gray. Its trucks were rusty, and the lettering was nearly illegible. It was small, only 28 feet in length, far smaller than all the other freight cars around it. But it was perfect for what was needed.
"Oh, Baylor," she called out, "I do think I found a spare boxcar for the extra cargo. Could you come over here and pick it up? I don't want to touch this filthy thing."
Baylor, who was already sick and tired of Bertrude's complaining, obliged, and came over to pick up the boxcar. However, once he saw it, he immediately stopped his movement. Bertrude had only ever done passenger work before this, and so was disconnected from all things freight-related. Baylor, on the other hand, knew exactly what this old boxcar was, and was hesitant to take it.
Bertrude?"
he winced. "I don't think we should take this one."
"And why not?" Bertrude retorted. "I mean, yes, it's a little small, but there's not much extra cargo."
"You don't understand. This boxcar has a reputation amongst us freight engines. If I were you, I'd find another boxcar immediately."
"Listen, Baylor, we don't have time for this. Just grab that boxcar, get it loaded, and let's get this job over with, shall we?"
"Geez, I didn't know you were in such a rush to get back to your pretty little passenger duties." Baylor sighed. "All right, you win. But if something bad happens, it's on you." So Baylor coupled up to boxcar number 13 and proceeded to attach it to the now fully assembled manifest. The workmen loaded it with the last pieces of cargo, and shortly thereafter, Bertrude proceeded to couple up in front of Baylor. Benji was already in the train, serving as the middle helper. At last, the train was complete, and with the full train crew ready, Bertrude, Baylor, and Benji set off with the train. As the trio proceeded down the line, soon things started to feel off. Every time they applied their brakes, it took longer than they expected to stop. Then things got bad. Very bad. Near the town of Windward, the engineer tried to apply the air brake, but the brakes didn't apply. He tried a second time, and still it didn't go off. Then the third time, he tried to apply the air brake, but it did not go off. Baylor and Benji and Bertrude immediately started to panic because now they were a runaway train. The train crew immediately called for the dispatcher, warning of the danger they were in. Further down the line, Atlas and Jeffrey were hauling a westbound freight. Then their engineer heard the call on the radio, warning of the incoming runaway. Then the two little Joes heard a sound off in the distance, down the line. "What is noise?" Atlas asked. "I'm not sure, Atlas," Jeffrey responded. "Let's try and listen closely." So the two little Joes listened intently, and as the sound grew, they knew immediately what it was. And then, just 3 miles ahead, they saw the runaway. "Oh, bleh!" screamed Atlas. "Quick! Reverse! Now!" And Atlas blared his horn loudly. The conductor immediately leapt from the caboose at the rear, and lined the switch into the siding, and called out to the engineer, who immediately set Atlas and Jeffrey into reverse. There wasn't any time to lose, as they had to get out of the way, otherwise they would certainly die. Atlas and Jeffrey sped back quickly. Bertrude, Baylor, and Benji were rapidly approaching at dangerous speeds. The engineers on both trains were panicking. Bertrude, Baylor, and Benji were only a quarter-mile away when Jeffrey and Atlas finally truly retreated into the siding. The conductor of Atlas and Jeffrey's train quickly grasped on the turnout lever as tightly as he could, and just before Bertrude, Baylor, and Benji's train reached the points, the conductor shoved at the lever with all his might, lining the points away from the siding. The 3 box cabs and their long, heavy train quickly sped past down the main line. A fatal collision was narrowly avoided. Jeffrey exhaled with relief. "Oh, that was close!" Atlas agreed. "Dah, too close." Further down the line, Duggard and Arlo were waiting at a siding when the call came in from the radio, warning of the runaway. Arlo and Duggard, wasting zero time, decided they were going to try and stop the runaway. So the switch was set and the two of them proceeded out of the siding and onto the main line. The switch was quickly turned back, and Arlo and Duggard proceeded quickly down the main line, gaining enough speed to ensure a smooth contact. The runaway was soon in sight, but Arlo and Duggard did not lessen the pace. The runaway soon caught up, with a loud clunk, Arlo and Duggard were coupled up to Bertrude, who was still screaming at this point. Then, with loud screeching, Arlo and Duggard applied the brakes, trying to stop the runaway. However, soon they saw something ahead that made them shudder. There, up ahead, was Jared, and he was pulling the Southside Flyer. Arlo and Duggard began to panic as they tried desperately to stop the runaway. "Luga bliat!" Jared screamed, as he immediately noticed Arlo, Duggard, and the runaway. He immediately stopped and went into full reverse to avoid collision. Second by second, and now everyone was panicking. Arlo was screaming, Duggard was screaming, they were all screaming. Arlo immediately shut his eyes, preparing for the worst. But with a shrill screech and a loud groan, Arlo, Duggard, and the runaway finally came to a halt. There was only a single inch between Arlo and Jared's knuckle couplers when the runaway was stopped, and by some miracle, disaster was narrowly avoided. Shortly thereafter, an investigation took place to figure out the cause of the runaway, and this was what the inspectors found. A majority of the freight cars of the train were found to have defective air pipes, as well as defective air tanks, and the cause of the damage to these freight cars was deemed to be excessive wear from overuse. As for the few freight cars that didn't have any air hose or air tank damage, amongst that group was Boxcar number 13. Moreover, the majority of the leaking freight cars were situated just behind Boxcar number 13 in the train, and just before Benji, who was situated in the middle. Needless to say, Baylor blamed Bertrude for allowing Boxcar number 13 to be part of the train, and for causing the whole incident to occur. Duggard instantly shut him up, telling him, It ain't her fault. It's yours for not telling her the full truth." And so, Duggard explained to Bertrude the full history of the 13th boxcar, and all the incidents it was involved with. Needless to say, Bertrude, from that day forward, became much more aware of the malevolent presence of the 13th boxcar, and intended to keep away from it. However, there was to be another major incident involving boxcar number 13, one with more fatal consequences. By this point of time, there were fewer Quill and Bipolar Electrics hauling passenger trains. Most of that work was assigned to the Little Joes. However, One Quill and one Bipolar were still working hard on passenger duties. Those two locomotives being Brian and Bradley, Bipolar and Quill respectively. A while back, Bradley was trialed for freight trains. However, being a Quill locomotive, his mechanical problems plagued him throughout his entire freight trial, and so he was returned to passenger service. Brian, on the other hand, was never trialed in freight, and remained solely a passenger engine. However, one day in the summer of 1961, Brian was approached by one of the dispatchers. He was told to head down the line to Westburg Yard to pick up a manifest train. Brian, however, was not having any of it. "A freight train? Me? Good heavens, no! Besides, I'm already scheduled to take the Bardington to Killington special, and I don't have the time to be reassigned." The dispatcher was about to retaliate. However, just then, Bradley rolled in. "Listen, Mr. Finnard, sir. I do believe there's already 2 engines ready to take that manifest. Vincent and Vinny, I believe. From the NIR. I'm sure Brian can take his passenger train." Mr. Finnard, the dispatcher, pondered this mix-up in the schedules, and after calling with the management and the other dispatchers, he returned, "Oh, all right. You win this time, Brian. But after you're finished with your special, you better return here to Bardington Yards to start your freight trial." Brian agreed, but was really scheming to avoid work any freight whatsoever, and so proceeded towards the station to collect the special. Meanwhile, down in Westburg Yard, specifically the NIR portion, Vincent and Vinny, the 2 E3Bs, were collecting the manifest and preparing to head out. The train was comprised of a standard boxcar, followed by several oil tanker cars filled with crude oil, as well as other boxcars, gondolas, and reefers. And one of the boxcars behind the oil tankers was boxcar number 13. The twin E3Bs set out with their freight train, while at the same time, Brian was leaving with his special. None of the 3 electrics knew what was to ensue some moments later. That day, the track between Westburg and Bardington were temporarily made dark territory in order to service the signals of the line. Of course, Vincent and Vinny weren't informed of this, and so they proceeded, passing every green signal they could, when in truth, those signals were meant to be off. Brian, who was made late by the dispatcher, was now speeding down the line to make up for lost time, and he kept passing darkened signals, given orders to proceed without stopping. Down the line, Vincent and Vinny were proceeding up the line, unaware that they were in the path of danger. There was a rocky outcrop where the rails curved around, and as Vincent and Vinny were approaching the curve, Brian suddenly appeared, going full speed. The distance between them and Brian was only a quarter mile. "Oh crap, Vinny!" Vincent called out. "We need to stop! Now!" And so the 2 of them applied the brakes. Brian too saw Vincent and Vinny, and cried out, "Oh, hell no!" and also applied his brakes. Unfortunately, there was not enough time to stop, and so Brian collided headfirst into Vincent and Vinny. It was utter chaos as the special passenger and freight trains were crumpled like paper. The oil tankers were busted, and sparks caused by the collision immediately ignited the contents. Passengers who survived the initial crash were now fleeing for the hills as tankers began to burst into levees. The remote location also made the collision infinitely worse, as firefighters and medical personnel had a difficult time reaching the crash site. 3 days. 3 long, hellish days was the time it took for the blaze to die down and to be put under control. And after that, the recoveries and cleanup began. Miraculously, Brian survived the collision, but he was out cold and badly burnt. He needed a complete rebuild after the disaster. Unfortunately, his engineer wasn't so fortunate. Brian's engineer died in the collision, and so did Vincent and Vinny's train crew. 56 passengers perished, and about 111 were severely injured. As for Vincent and Vinny, both of them were crumpled and crushed underneath Brian's damaged frame, and both were unsalvageable, later being sent to Killington Steelworks to be scrapped. The cleanup took several weeks to complete, but just before it was done, another discovery was made. Amongst the scorched remains of the tankers, and amongst the crumpled boxcars and gondolas, was Boxcar number 13, slightly burnt but mostly unmarred by the whole catastrophe. Its presence filled the railwaymen, cleanup crew, and survivors with dread. Later on, when Brian was told that Boxcar number 13 was present in that collision, Brian simply said that he wasn't surprised, for he'd heard from Duggart about that boxcar and the misfortune it brought. After the investigations were complete, and the cause of the disaster determined, the Mountain Roads management turned their attention towards Boxcar number 13, for by this time, Boxcar number 13 was nearing 100 years old, and was well past its expected lifespan. The other 12 boxcars it came with back in the 1860s had long been scrapped before this, and the management deemed it was time to retire this ailing 28-foot boxcar from mainline service. Still, however, the management wanted to utilize it, and so, in 1962, it was shunted to Westburg Yards, where it was to be utilized as a tool storage shed for railroad workmen. However, one final incident would change the management's mood. An incident both terrifying and haunting. The incident took place in October of 1973. One railroad worker, whose name is now forgotten, entered into Boxcar number 13 and didn't come out again. As the weeks went by, there was talk of a putrid smell going round in Westburg Yard, and soon the origin of the smell was determined to be from the tool storage shed, Boxcar number 13. A team of yard workers, along with the yardmaster, came to Boxcar number 13 to investigate the smell. They approached the boxcar, and with a collaborative heave, they opened the door. The yardmaster made a blood-curdling scream. One of the yard workers immediately turned away while another vomited onto the ground. The police were immediately called to the scene. The police entered the boxcar to investigate, and what they found traumatized them. All over the walls was written in the workers' blood, "The 13th boxcar will ride again." For weeks after, the police investigated the scene, trying to figure out who or what did this. The investigations remained inconclusive. As for the railroad workers, they continued saying that the workman's death was the work of the 13th boxcar. "After all," they said, "the writing within boxcar number 13 clearly shows us that it did it." Even the locomotives claimed it was boxcar number 13, and some even said that in some ways it was alive. Finally, the management had come to an understanding. They understood now that Boxcar number 13 was indeed cursed, and that it was dangerous and shouldn't be utilized anymore. However, after what had happened to that workman who entered it, it was found brutally slaughtered. The management was afraid of what might happen to them if they decided to scrap it. Time passed, and there was a long debate on what to do with Boxcar number 13. Finally, in late September of 1974, the management agreed that the old abandoned siding in Bardington Yards, siding number 13, would be Boxcar number 13's final resting place. The locomotive they had assigned to move Boxcar number 13 was Al, and on October 1st, it was moved. Al was wary the whole time he was coupled up to Boxcar number 13. He feared that something might happen. However, nothing did happen. Instead, he made it all the way to Bardington Yards, where he dropped off Boxcar number 13 onto the abandoned siding, and from there he went off on his way. And later, the power was temporarily shut off in Bardington Yards to cut away the wire that was over the abandoned siding, to ensure that no other locomotive would ever touch Boxcar number 13 again. Unfortunately, however, since Al was the last locomotive who touched Boxcar number 13, the last bit of Boxcar number 13's misfortune fell upon him. Later, in November of 1974, while Al was delivering a long, heavy goods train up the Shadowstone Pass, there was a landslide that triggered the ground beneath him to give way. Al fell to his demise, taking with him his 2 engineers and his entire train. The conductor and flagman aboard his train managed to jump clear from the caboose before it fell down. Al's death had a huge effect on the mountain road, as well as the neighboring electric railroads. All of the box cabs, Duggard and Arlo especially, were hard hit. The Little Joes too were saddened, as was Brian, Bradley, and all the electric locomotives and crews who had known and worked with him. Then the 1970s ended and the 1980s began, and in 1981, the Mountain Road began its electrification refurbishment project. Every box cab, Little Joe, steeple cab, and even Bradley and Brian were to be completely overhauled. Their frames melted down and recasted, and all of them converted to AC power, and even their speeds upgraded. Every electrical and mechanical issue undone, and all of them were to be permanently preserved. And this plan even spread to the other electric railroads. By the year 1990, the ER project was completed, and every single surviving electric locomotive felt brand new. And in the following years, the Mountain Road, as well as its neighbors, the East Mountain and Oceanic, the North Iron Ridge, and the Shadowstone Railway would all prosper. Ultimately, the true toll of the 13th boxcar is forever unknown. But what is known is this. The 13th boxcar still waits. It still sits, to this day, on that old abandoned siding in Bardington Yards. Its once white paint all gone. Its once black roof now gray and rusted. Its trucks all worn out. But its crimson number still remains. It sits there, waiting for the day when some foolish visitor from the north, ignorant of all it has done, comes to Bardington Yard in need of a spare boxcar. It sits there, silently, patiently waiting for when it will finally ride again.